Good morning, Professor.
Good morning.
Yes, I have here with me Professor Souleymane Bachir Diagne. And of course, this is not the first time to meet. Last week we were together here in Bremen at the podcast studio. And that was my first time to interview you. And this week I'm interviewing you again. We are still in Bremen, but this time we're in a different venue. And here we are at the Überseemuseum, or the Overseas Museum, as the English translation would have it. And this time, I would like to do it a bit differently because people also have a chance to listen to the podcast that we had, but I also want to do it differently for the video interview. And last time, I was the one who introduced you, but this time I would like you to introduce yourself and your work to our viewers and our listeners.
Yes, so as you mentioned it, my last name, Diagne, would indicate that I am a Senegalese national. Souleymane Bachir, meaning actually is those are my first and middle name. And I'm a professor of philosophy. I've been teaching for 20 years back in Senegal at the University Cheikh Anta Diop University in Dakar. And I've been teaching for the past 22 years in the US. I first taught philosophy and religion at Northwestern University, where I was also part of the program of African Studies. And since 2008, I've been at Columbia University in New York with a double appointment in the departments of French and Francophone Studies, where I teach French philosophy, African philosophy, and the philosophy department where I teach mainly Islamic philosophy. So I work and publish, I teach and publish in different fields, mainly the following ones: of course, history of philosophy in general, history of mathematical logic, that was my first specialty, then African philosophy, as I indicated, and Islamic philosophy. Those are the fields in which I have written books and I have taught classes for more than 40 years in Dakar, in Chicago or Evanston, near Chicago, and now Columbia in New York.
Okay, interesting to hear about your interdisciplinary work in philosophy. And maybe just to break it down for our audience out there, for people who might think maybe philosophy is just an academic discipline, the way you've described your work as an academic, maybe why is it important that everyone should care about philosophy?
Well, philosophy is very difficult to define, obviously. Definition of philosophy would take books and books. But one could agree that philosophical thinking is the discipline that examines questions in a very radical way. And when I say radical, when I'm using the word radical, I have in mind the etymology of the word, which is taking questions at their very root. And this is something, obviously, we need to do. It is part of our humanity, in a way, to pose fundamental questions about precisely what that humanity means. What is it that we can know? What is it that we should be doing? What is it that we could hope for? And actually, by listing these questions, I'm already quoting a very famous philosopher here in Bremen, since we are in Germany, which is Immanuel Kant. So those questions are really fundamental questions. And I believe that we need, in the African context, because you and I are interested in the African context, obviously, we need to be able to construct philosophical concepts, to name the problems we are facing, to name the questions we are facing, to formulate them and to address them and deal with them. And that is the role of philosophy. Again, this is a very short answer to a question that is very complicated and would take more than just one, a couple of sentences that I have offered.
Yes, indeed, it's very complicated, but maybe just as a follow-up on that, and talking about radical critique and grabbing things, issues by the roots, we live in an age where there's a culmination of different global challenges. So there are a lot of wars and military conflicts, there's collapsing healthcare systems, rising economic inequality, continued neocolonialism, and at the same time, but there's also resistance to these oppressive forces. So we see a lot of student protests, for instance, at your own university in Colombia, we see a lot of student protests that are going on. We see protests on the African continent for better service delivery. We see students protesting for an end to settler colonialism. And we see movements such as Black Lives Matter, Me Too. And there is a combination of all these going on at the same time. And that also in this particular age, we also see that there is sort of also state repression, and trying to shrink the civic space is also right there at the same time. So in this particular age, what can you say is the responsibility and duty of the philosopher when it comes to speaking out against injustices and speaking for justice?
You know, Senegalese poet, philosopher and statesman Léopold Sédar Senghor had a declaration that I often quote when he said that we have to fight in order to eliminate what he called the line of injustice between North and South. And actually one could say that within every single nation there is a North and a South. In other words, the line of injustice is not just between nations from the North and the South, it is also inside nations, because inequality is one of the fundamental questions of our time as well. And inequality, coming with inequality, oppression, injustice, etc., etc. So it is the mission, I would say, I would use the strong word mission. It is the mission of intellectuals in general and philosophers in particular to be on the side of that resistance. So resistance to injustice, if we want to name it, means being on the side of social justice. And what social justice demands now within nations, when it comes to relationship between nations, the so-called global South and the North, inequality everywhere in the world, that is what we need to address. And the intellectual struggle, the intellectual combat against those lines of injustice are the intellectual side of the political struggle against those lines of injustice. But you have mentioned it also. The crisis, we are living in a world of multi-crisis and a world of fragmentation. Fragmentation is something that we are witnessing today. Fragmentation and the rise of ethno-nationalism. We are just right now witnessing the rise of very extremist parties everywhere in the world, parties that are called populists, and who are building their platform on hatred for difference, hatred for the other. And this is characteristic of the time in which we are living, and we see it everywhere in the North, in the South as well. And so it means that this is the time when we have to oppose to the forces of fragmentation a form of universalism. We have to call for a horizon of universality, and we have to call for the first of all universal, which is an idea of humanity. We cannot continue to live in this fragmentation. And we cannot also just think that any time you talk about something being universal, you are actually being either naive or being duped by imperialism, etc. It is unfortunate that sometimes we understand that to fight against colonialism or coloniality in general is to be on relativistic positions and just insist on particularism and identities, etc. We should never forget the goal of humanity, as it was called by a famous French socialist, Jean Jaurès. We should never forget the horizon of universality that we have also to be aiming at. We are still, politics should be the goal of recreating that horizon of universality and reclaiming the first universal, that is humanity, against everything that is a fragmentation of humanity, the first of the forces of fragmentation being inequality and oppression, as you mentioned. And I believe that this is the role of philosophy, and it is in that exploration of new meanings of the universal, now that the imperial form of universalism has died or is dying, it is in that exploration that I am pursuing and conducting my work at the time being.
Okay, yeah, so maybe to come, I know that, and we talked about it also in the podcast, that you are committed to rehabilitating the concept of the universal, and you also speak of universality. But one can also make the argument that what we are seeing, you talked about the rise of these populist parties. You can see that this backlash is also one can argue that the imperial form of universalism is not yet dead. There are forces that are trying also to revive it, and they are working very hard. So how can you reconcile how you are thinking of universality and also others who are trying to return us to their form of universality?
Well, the kind of, to name it, I have, my work is identified today with this concept of horizontal universal or lateral universal. Actually, it is not a concept that I invented. I took it from French philosopher Maurice Merleau-Ponty. What it means is that you do not have an overarching universal, the imperial universal anymore, but we still have to work for this lateral horizontal universal that is going to be forged by cultures and languages that are sharing the same plane of immanence, with no province of the world decreeing that they are actually the incarnation of the universal. So this universal, this horizon of universality, as I call it, is also against a supremacist notion of universal. It is in the struggle against a supremacist notion of the universal that we are going to make that horizon of universality emerge, and that we are going to forge a notion of humanity against fragmentation that would be against the form that you have mentioned. But obviously, yes, that supremacism has not disappeared, and it is a fundamental ingredient of the kind of extremist parties that we have been talking about, and that is the backlash, of course, yes.
Okay, and also now thinking, going more deeper into this question of responsibilities, duties of the philosopher. When it comes to the political environment now, we see a lot of student protests, students speaking out. And my question going to you, as a tenured professor, is what is the duty and responsibility of a tenured professor? And also maybe just to bring in a little bit of background to where this question is coming from. Since I study online spaces, so there was like a play on this question, can the subaltern speak? And then there was a playful critique in online spaces, can the tenured speak? So it was a sort of critique to professors, people who have tenure, who have been given that tenure and are supposed to speak out when when there are injustices, but that is maybe not always happening. So it was that sort of critique. So my question coming to you as a tenured professor, what sort of responsibility, what extra responsibility does a professor who is tenured have?
Responsibility is an absolute. So I don't understand why responsibility would be qualified as responsibility of a tenured versus a non-tenured, and a professor versus somebody who is not a professor, who might be a student, who might be, etc. If you are thinking about the risks of actually speaking out, this is a different matter. If you only speak out for social justice, if there is no risk for you doing that, what does that speaking out also mean? So if my answer would be first and foremost that it is the responsibility of everybody to speak out against injustice, against oppression. And my experience actually is, if I just see people around me, because we don't have numbers, we don't have precise figures about who is protesting and who is tenured professor among those who are protesting, etc. But if I take my experience at Columbia, the day when most of us were standing on the stairs on campus next to that statue, that beautiful statue we have on campus facing Law Library and called Alma Mater, when we were standing there in our regalia protesting the fact that police had been called on our students, we were just faculty, and we were not looking at who was tenured or who was not tenured, who was in this position or in that position. So if we look at the ethical notion of what protest means, history is full of people who have protested risking far more than just the kind of reprimand or that. I mean, the example of protests that we see in history, those who risk their lives to protest, show that again, fighting against injustice and speaking out against injustice is an absolute. And if you look at even out, independently from the academic field in which we are, religions say as much. In my own religion, Islam, it is said that if you see injustice, you should do something against it. If you can't, speak about it. And if you really, for some reason, absolutely cannot, just be against it from the bottom of your heart. So this gradation is something that indicates the absolute nature of commitment to social justice.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so yeah, I was thinking, as you've explained, I was thinking, yes, in terms of risks, that the risks are different, because we can argue that tenured professors are relatively protected from that risk, or maybe from getting fired from your job. Although, I mean, sometimes it does happen that people will get cancelled. For instance, in Germany, we've had several instances of people getting disinvited from events or getting cancelled from events. So the risks are sort of different. Mm-hmm. So for perhaps a student or someone who does not have tenure and someone who has. So in that particular way that, you know, the forces, when they're repressive forces, for instance, even the state will make use, you know, of these different gradations, that there are different risks, and then to instill fear in the masses differently. So yeah, in that way, considering that the risks are also different for different people. That's where my question was coming from.
I see.
And that's why I was emphasizing the responsibility on the professor.
Absolutely. And I understand that also the background of your question is somehow the German academic situation, which I do not know much about. This is why actually having in mind the situation in the US, I did not see that a tenured professor who had something to say and who wanted to protest one way or another about the situation did not do it. So we do not have figures that would indicate, for example, that they did not engaged in the current situation. Yes, so I understand. I understand that. On the other hand, if the question is also the question of freedom of speech. So if one just thinks that they do not have to exercise freedom of speech because freedom of speech implies a certain number of risks, then freedom of speech is in danger. Because if you start censoring yourself in advance and not using your freedom of speech for, you can decide that you want to have a more balanced type of position. You can decide, for example, that a petition being circulated, you cannot sign it because of a particular sentence you are not agreeing with. This is something different. But when you think that there is something you need to say, that you must say, and the only reason why you do not say it is that you are not really sure that you can exercise your freedom of speech, this is the best way of killing the very notion of freedom of speech. So, and this is a fundamental principle in academia. Academia is a space where people speak their mind and engage in discussion and argumentation. That is the most important aspect. The freedom of speech goes with the capacity to listen to the other position and to discuss it, to engage in argument with them. And so this is the reason why the limitation of what one can say or not would be hatred, hate speech, and also the form of violence, that is an opposition, a radical opposition to hearing counter-argumentation, for example.
So I think, I think that point on the freedom of speech would be a good point. I think to move from these general debates, and I mean, just to conclude on that question of freedom of speech, because I think it's become very current right now, like where are the limits of freedom of speech? Where does hate speech start? And for instance, I can give an example of the United States, where there is a backlash against critical race theory, for example, and some others also, like some political forces, arguing that it is hate speech. There is that sort of backlash. So how, when there are different opposing forces competing for concepts, how do we sort of reach a place where we have dialogue and discuss?
Well, until recently, critical race theory was academic discourse and could be discussed within academia. The new situation that you call backlash actually is the fact that politicians are getting involved. They are turning politics into tribal cultural wars. And in that atmosphere of tribal cultural wars, the ethno-nationalism that I was talking about, what one should be teaching and what one should not be teaching has become a kind of football in that game, in that very insane and actually totally not useful game of politics around the cultural wars. So why would a governor decide what should be taught in academia? And academic freedom is precisely that. Questions are discussed within academia. And actually what people are saying against critical race theory is not so much that it is hate speech. They are saying that it is not serious actually academic topic, and that it's wrong about in terms of looking at history and so on and so forth. So arguments such as those can be and should be discussed within academia, but making the political powers decide what should be taught, that is the end of freedom of speech and the end of academic freedom.
Okay, so I think that's a good point where we ended. And I also wanted us, because we are in the Überseemuseum,
yeah,
and I just also wanted us to, in the African section of the Überseemuseum, I just wanted us to see the exhibition a little bit, but also reflect on questions of how museums help to shape dominant narratives of a place, and in this particular case being Africa. So maybe we can visit the exhibition a little bit and see and talk more about that. So I'm interested in these objects, and I just want us to talk a little bit about these objects, because right now there are issues of decolonization, of decolonizing museums going on, and talking about how these objects came to be in Western museums, and also about restitution, taking them back to where they were stolen from. And here I'm interested in these objects, and I'll just read the text that accompanies them here. And it says that there are 18 objects from the Royal Court of Benin in the collection of the Überseemuseum. The result of a provenance research indicates that all of them originate from a clear context of injustice, the British punitive expedition of 1897. And therefore, in accordance with the joint political declaration between the Federal Republic of Germany and the Federal Republic of Nigeria of 1st July 2022, we too will transfer ownership of the 18 objects to Nigeria. The Nigerian side will then choose which of these objects will be returned and which will continue to be on loan to us. It is not yet clear when this will take place, but the Nigerian parties will start the process. So, yeah. I mean, also, I just want to, hear from you what you think about how they describe this text, how they have written their text, how these objects came to be, and how they are thinking about the process of restitution placed here in the Überseemuseum.
Well, these objects are examples of so-called bronzes of Benin. I say so-called because the material is not always bronze, but that is the name for this very peculiar art, recognizable very easily. And the question of provenance is also easy to solve. If it is a bronze of Benin, it comes from the looting that followed the 1897 expedition. There is no other origin for these bronzes. So it was easy to establish what the provenance is. And I actually think that the model that has been set between Germany and Nigeria in terms of restitution, keeping certain objects on loan, is a good model. People should be looking at that model, and I hope that it is going to establish a precedent. Because, again, just the idea of emptying museums in the north from their Benin bronzes and filling a museum in Nigeria with all the Benin bronzes coming from all over the places and different museums is not so much the way to go. Restitution on legal grounds has to happen, but this model of partnership, this model of recognizing the fact that this art has become a nomadic art, has become, as I call it in my work, a mutant art. I think that the kind of agreement that is being designed between Germany and Nigeria is a good agreement, and that should set a precedent when it comes to the question of restitution.
Okay, all right. Yeah, so, okay, so here you're talking about the process between Nigeria and Germany sort of being a model that more can learn from. And so maybe let's move on across the museum and see if we can find more models. So maybe we can think about who is represented here, the African heroes that they have represented here, and if they are a good representation of the work that is going on in Africa.
As you say, I mean, it is a selection, and a selection is just that, a selection, meaning that it is always, you can always point toward missing figures. We can all agree that we have true African heroes here. If I read the name of Wangari Maathai, if I read the name of Wole Soyinka, if I read the name of Nawal al-Saadawi, or Leopold Sedar Senghor up there, or Desmond Tutu, we will all agree that we are talking about African contemporary heroes. I think that even though it was unavoidable that certain figures would be missing, a figure of someone like Cheikh Anta Diop should definitely be here. This Senegalese historian who has devoted his life to, in a way, to just summarize it, restitute Egypt to Africa and restitute Africa to Egypt, sort of remembering the integrity of African history in connection with the history of ancient Egypt. And I think that this is a very important aspect of Africa, of the African continent, and the intellectuals working on the history of Africa and the contemporary presence of Africa in the world. So I would think that such a figure cannot be missed, even though, again, I can understand that a selection cannot just bring in everybody.
Yeah, and yeah, I think that's a very important point that you make. And talking about ancient Egypt, I think it hasn't been brought in forcefully in the current reiteration of decolonization debates about the connection of ancient Egypt to Africa. And also maybe when it comes to reviving, looking back at African history or at African written texts. I know you're also interested in African written text, although you work on translation and oral literatures as well, but you're also very much interested in ancient African texts.
That's true.
And how this, I think they belong to the decolonization discourses that we are having right now. So maybe just to re-emphasize that point, how do we strongly bring in that history of ancient Egypt, also considering that there is limited expertise and not many people know how to read the ancient texts and where to find these ancient texts.
That's true. I mean, those are objective limitations, of course. But you are absolutely right. Representing an African tradition of written erudition, because the association of Africa with orality, being the land of orality, of course, is a correct representation. But it is time now, because African historiography has been moving towards that direction as well, to also recognize this tradition of written erudition with intellectual centers such as Timbuktu in Mali, or Djenné, or Koki in Senegal, or the northern part of Nigeria today in the Sokoto Kingdom, etc. So maybe a figure such as a representation of Ahmed Baba of Timbuktu, who is probably one of the most famous intellectuals, philosophers of ancient Mali and in Timbuktu, would be a way of doing just that. But again, a selection is a selection, and it is always a problem to have everything represented. There is just so much a museum can do, turning a narrative into images and visual representations.
Yes, so yes, a selection is a selection. And maybe we can move on to the next spot where maybe I also want us to discuss something, because they talk about resources in Africa, the extractivism of African resources, and I just want us to see how they portray that and to get your opinion of it. When I myself visited the museum, I thought there was a decontextualization there. It doesn't forcefully engage with the colonialism discourses that the ones who colonized the Africans were the ones who also dispossessed it, and they're the ones who are also in charge of the resources. There is an acknowledgement of that, but I thought it's not very much present. So maybe we could visit that and I can get your expert opinion on that. So I was also interested to talk about this particular space where they have a display of different resources from the African continent, and they talk about African resources, they try to talk about extractivism, but when I visited the exhibition, I thought there is that acknowledgement, but I also thought there is a decontextualization, because there isn't much going into the detail. Of course, you can't go into detail in the museum, but there isn't that forceful acknowledgement of how the resource extraction is connected to colonialism. Those who colonize the African continent are the ones who are also in charge of resources. So I just wanted to get your impression of how well can museums talk about the question of African resources, the role of Western countries in resource extraction, and how that has to do with poverty in Africa.
Yes, again, we have to look at the question of translation. How do you translate a narrative into visualization, which is what museum does? This representation of a certain number of African resources in connection with a text that says basically that Africa, the African continent, is potentially very rich, but at the same time, in reality today, poor. It's not false. It is nothing false is being said there. Maybe yes, try to find a way of saying something visually about the fact that extractivism meant that colonial powers were interested in tracing routes or railroads actually from the point of extraction to the port where they would be taken to Europe. So Africa, in the very the nature of African infrastructures is oriented towards actually the former colonial power we have, and we need now to develop horizontal relationships. We need to trade with one another on the African continent. We have to build that African unity. And this is another way of reading this narrative, saying we are potentially rich, but until now we have been rich in resources, but for extraverted economies. It is time that our economies develop from within, obviously in an endogenous way, and also for the benefit of our populations, and we will do that by building a true Pan-Africanism using the phrase that has been used by pioneers on the African continent of United States of Africa. This is how I read this. Now, how do you represent that is a question of scenography, museal scenography. But I agree with you, and as it is, it calls attention to this contradiction that we have a continent that is potentially very rich, but its history, the history of colonialism and the way in which the economies have been established for the interest of the colonial powers, actually is impeding the form of development that we want to see happen on the continent, and Africans are responding to that. So instead of devoting too much narrative to, yes, it is true that we are rich in resources but poor, but it is the fault of, okay, let's have a sentence or two about that. But the most important aspect is to say, how do we turn things around? How do we manage to have infrastructures that will connect us to one another and make us trade with one another, instead of having infrastructure that are always for extraverted economies?
Yeah, so I think maybe we just stop there. We'll still stay at this particular spot. I think that's a very important point about how you're describing it. From the way I interpret it, you're talking about opening up the African continent to itself, encouraging trade between the different countries, and maybe also stopping this sort of ethno-nationalisms within the continent itself, drawing lessons from the older statesmen on African Unite. But also, I would also just like to bring to your attention, I mean, there have been African statesmen who have tried strongly to bring this to reality. So they might have had their different shortfalls, but they've tried it different ways. So there was, for example, Gaddafi, the late Gaddafi, Sankara. Their efforts did not always materialize. While we speak of, maybe we can say the imperial order is falling, but in a way it is still very much strong, and Africa remains very much in debt which cannot be paid off, and these international financial institutions still have a very strong hold on the African continent. How do we move on from that history that brought us here, but also taking into consideration that there are still these very powerful forces that are sort of preventing Africa from turning things around?
Like in every struggle, you have to take into account what the other side is doing, obviously. But by deciding to have ZLECAf, which is just in its infancy, this African single market is still in its infancy, but I believe that it is already developing trade within Africa at a small rate, too slowly maybe. We work on accelerating that. And also we really take seriously the institutions that we have given ourselves, and we work on those institutions. We have ECOWAS, which is in bad shape today because of nations that are now under military rule, and you cannot construct actually regional integration if you do not have democratic countries participating in that. By definition, a country that is under a coup or under military regime has just set aside their constitution. They are not going to respect any other kind of agreement with other people. So we need to work on those. The African Union has said that we have 5 regions on the African continent. Let's work in reinforcing those 5 regions, develop those 5 regions with the perspective of unifying the totality, making sure that since the world is now getting closed to us, to African black and brown bodies, at least let's eliminate the borders within the African continent And let's go back to the dream of the founders. You mentioned heroes of Pan-Africanism. Let's not forget about Kwame Nkrumah, who continentalized Pan-Africanism. Before the first Pan-African conference was organized in Ghana, all Pan-African Congress were organized outside because Pan-Africanism was coming from the so-called New World. He continentalized it in the double sense that it became primarily the affair of continental Africa, and also it was the totality of the continent from Cairo to Cape, because we have now a kind of Pan-Africanism which is more insisting about blackness and looking again toward the New World. That is fine, but let's not forget that when we build the United States of Africa, we are talking about the totality of Africa, from Maghreb to Cape in South Africa. And so it just what you say about the resistance and the forces that oppose African unity is just a way of saying, okay, let's be aware of those forces and let's work with what we have. Our African Development Bank, our ECOWAS, our SADC, etc., everything that we have now, and let's mobilize in particular our youth towards that concrete construction of the African continent, and not speeches about and the theater of sovereignty and Pan-Africanism, etc., etc. Work with the institutions that we have and make sure that we develop them and that we work, if we need to change them, and they need to be changed to become really institutions for the African people, we will be doing that, but by keeping them and thinking that this is the right way to go.
Okay. I think strengthening our institutions, African institutions, that's a good point to end this. And maybe one last thing, I think we are running out of time. The last thing that I just wanted us to see, because I think it would be amiss if we do not discuss this, is now we are talking about issues of climate change, but when it comes, at least in the Western context, when it comes to the idea of Africa, the image of Africa is usually that of a safari, the savannas, and well, it is true that in Africa, indeed, it is rich with such resources, but there is a stereotype about such type of representation. And when these different tropes are put together time and again, and I also think there was this very now seminal satirical piece that was written by the Kenyan author, Binyavanga Wainaina, about how to write about Africa and the constant tropes and images that are used to portray Africa. And maybe if we look here in the museum and how they have sort of represented the African landscape along their walls, maybe you can have something to say about it.
Okay.
Yeah. So I think just to conclude our visit in the museum, you know, just maybe if you can make a comment on how museums can represent the diversity, the richness of Africa without resorting to the dominant tropes that are used to portray Africa. For instance, usually, sometimes the landscapes are shown without landscapes, without the people. There are dominant images of African safaris, and you know, that appeal sort of to the Western imagination. So how do we go beyond, you know, these tropes of Africa?
Well, one thing that is difficult to avoid is actually a museum situated in Europe, which is not appealing to the European imagination of Africa. So we have to go from the premise that this is probably normal. Although good museums now are going to be more attentive to African voices, to the African narrative from within Africa. And we have to make sure that we put forward that narrative ourselves. So I'm always calling to our own responsibility. Now, the same images can tell different stories. These images can talk about the fact also that Africa is one of the richest continents in terms of biodiversity. And we are living in a time now where we have to preserve that biodiversity, which means that African responsibility is engaged, and we have to understand things that way. We have biodiversity on our continent, and we are going to be the custodians of that biodiversity. Now that is the message probably we want to translate into images, for which we want to find a visual language. So again, it is a question of how you read images, and we should make sure that the comments accompanying the images are saying that type, putting forward that type of narrative, instead of just presenting Africa again as a continent where you have wild animals that excite the imagination of Europeans who want to go there and hunt lions or meet elephants, etc. So yes, that is how I would read these images, and I hope that these images are going to be read that way.
I think that's a very good point not to end it, Professor, and it's been a pleasure talking to you, and I really liked how you answered the last question about how do we translate this visually, because translation is also one of your main working areas. You think of philosophy as translation, and I could actually see you putting it in practice in this short visit during the museum. And to our audience, I would say this is it, and well, it's goodbye. Please, you can also listen to our other podcast that I had with Professor Diagne, which will be available on online spaces. And he's had several events with us. He's also had a panel discussion, which was recorded with some of my colleagues at the Contradiction Studies, for example, with Lindokule Shabani, which I'm sure you can also access online. So thank you very much, Professor.